Good morning. Hopefully you can all see me and hear me. Um, we have some commentary available, so if you're having trouble with audio or visual, feel free to let us know. My name is Suzanne Wilcox. I'm an attorney with Nelson Mullins, which is a law firm that's based out of South Carolina, Columbia, but we have offices here in Atlanta, and we're happy to be here helping out with this great partnership, doing some pro bono work for you all today. Thank you for all the good work you do. I'm going to be talking about vulnerable populations and abuse today. Not exactly the most entertaining topic, certainly one of those topics that we don't like to think about, but certainly when you work in the nonprofit area, unfortunately, is something that you run across. So if you have any questions as we go along, we'll talk about how you'll be able to share those with us today, and hopefully you all can hear me. And then we'll take questions as we go through. This is set for 45 minutes. We'll try to stay prompt and on time for you. I understand your time is valuable. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and get started. Just so you know my background, I'm an education attorney by trade. I usually work with educational entities, helping them stay compliant. But vulnerable populations, disabled folks, and children is something that we deal with a lot. And we'll be adding elderly folks to that list today as well. All right, so let's get started. Just to let you know more about the mission of the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta, they are looking to maximize the impact of pro bono engagement by connecting with a network of attorneys like myself with nonprofits to help you do the good work that you do. So we're really grateful for the work they do. There is some eligibility criteria. You can see those here. You can visit their website to get more information about them and their criteria. And there's lots of webinars and great topics that they host, so I encourage you to take a look and see if any of that information could be helpful for you. And here's the legal disclaimer. Being lawyers, we can't help ourselves. So I give the same disclaimer when I do my own trainings with my clients, but basically that this is not meant to be specific legal advice. This is just for information. And if you have a specific legal problem, you do need to seek legal counsel. All right, so let's start and talk about the roadmap. Where are we going? What are we going to be talking about? And you'll have to forgive me. Occasionally I will look down at my notes here. Occasionally I may check the watch just to make sure that we're not going over the time. Again, I try to be as conscientious of your time as I know you are. So just forgive me if you see my eyes darting all over the place. That's what I'm looking at. Well, our roadmap is pretty simple. We're going to be talking about who's a mandatory reporter. We're going to talk about who has to report, obviously, what has to be reported, and to who do you have to report, to whom do you have to report, when the reports have to be made, what your potential liability is, excuse me, what your protections are as a reporter, some of the common pitfalls that I see trip people up from time to time, and then a little bit about the documentation and policies that you should have or consider having. So you will see we have lots of information to cover. We have a limited amount of time, but I think it's enough for us to give you a good overview, maybe spur some questions on you didn't know you had. As far as questions are concerned, I am, as I've told the folks here, a babbler. So if you ask me a question in the middle of my presentation, I am likely to chase that rabbit all the way down the rabbit hole. So what I'm going to ask is that please feel free to send in their questions through the chat feature, but we're going to take them at the end. So just know that I'm not ignoring you. Those questions will be taken, but we'll take them at the end. And then we'll have the helpful folks here, share those with me, and then I'll give you the best answer I can. If you stump me, I'll be happy to be honest with you that I'm stumped, but we'll try to give you as good information as we can. All right, so what types of abuse and vulnerable populations are we talking about? We're talking about children, and those are minors, right, under the age of 18. And then elderly, which the law defines as 65 and older, excuse me, and disabled adult populations. And when we say disabled, we're talking about someone who's cognitively impaired, maybe has Alzheimer's, maybe has some other mental impairments. The law gives sort of a broad definition of that, so that's sort of a judgment call on your part whether or not they are truly disabled or not. So going on, who the mandatory reporters are. This is where my clients and other folks that I work with get a little bit frustrated because the law is very broad. Bottom line, everyone should be a mandatory reporter. And that I'm speaking not necessarily from a legal perspective, I'm speaking from a moral perspective. You've heard that expression, if you see something, say something. When we're dealing with vulnerable populations from a moral standpoint, you really do have a person-to-person obligation to speak up, to raise your hand, to say something's not right here. But when we're talking about our legal obligation, of course, that's a little more narrow. We're going to focus on that today. But I just want to encourage you that if, no matter what your role in an organization is, no matter whether you serve children or not, and you just happen to see something with a child out in your daily life, I encourage you, report that, because that you could be the only person who stepped up for that child or that vulnerable person. So I just encourage you to really think about that. But I'm going to be presenting the more narrow standard of legal. As far as who our mandatory reporters are with respect to the law, for children, and we've had some changes in the law, so if you haven't been trained on this in a while, there are some differences maybe than what you would expect. Anyone who's employed by or is volunteering, and that's the big difference in the last few years, at a child service organization is a mandatory reporter. And so if you're working in a nonprofit, that's probably where you're going to fall. And the law is very broad, and it gives a definition. It's a business or an organization, so you don't have to make money. It can be a charitable organization, whether it's public or private, whether it's for-profit, not-for-profit, whether it's voluntary, whether it's just volunteer work that you all coordinate, that provides any type of care, treatment, education, training, supervision, coaching, counseling, recreation programs, or shelter to children. Basically, anyone who is attending to a child pursuant to their duties, or works at a hospital, school, a social agency, or similar facility. And if you can't tell already, it's very broad. So if your organization is working with children in any way, shape, or form, I would encourage you to go ahead and inform your employees and your volunteers that you consider them to be mandatory reporters. Better to be safe and not sorry. And you're going to hear me say this over and over again probably during this training. But if you are in doubt whether or not you're a mandatory reporter or whether you should report, then you need to report. And I always tell folks, if you're asking me whether you should report, you should report. Okay, that's your rule of thumb. It is, and we'll talk about your protections. You have a lot of protections as a reporter, but what you don't have protection from is if you don't report and you're required to. So I really encourage you, if you're not sure, to go ahead and report. Now, that was more about children. Let's talk about adults, disabled or elderly adults. So it's similar to the child standard. If you are serving them in any capacity, if you are working with them, same kind of standard as the children, then you are going to be a mandatory reporter. And there's an additional layer with our adults and our elderly population. If you are an employee of a financial institution, I thought that was really interesting, or an investment company that has reasonable cause to believe, and we'll talk more about what that means, that there is some kind of abuse going on or exploitation, and we'll talk about what that looks like, financial exploitation, then you also have an obligation to report. So if you're working with them, just remember that's another layer of exploitation for those adults and disabled students. Now, there is an exception for fiduciaries if you're serving as a fiduciary. I'm not going to hit that very hard. That's kind of a rare exception. If you're in a fiduciary, you know it. So just be aware there is an exception for fiduciaries, though. And if you're a fiduciary and you find yourself in one of those situations, I recommend you speak to your organization's legal counsel, because that can be a little bit tricky. So that's beyond the scope of what we're talking today about, but I just want to let you know that. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this part because I feel like it's one of those things, you know it when you see it, an abuse situation. But in case you don't spend a lot of time around these populations, but you do kind of serve them, or in case you're just not familiar with some of the signs of abuse, I thought I would walk you through some of the helpful organizational information. Some of this I've gotten from DFACS, some of it I've gotten from the Department of Health Services, some of it I've gotten from the Georgia Department of Education. It's just lots of different sources. There's no magic formula for you to be able to tell when someone's being abused or exploited. What I tell people that work in your type of area is I trust your gut. You all have been doing this. You're around these folks. You understand when something's not right. What I like to say is you have a good sniffer. So with your sniffer, you're going to know if something's not right. And so this is going to give you some basis for why you think it's not right. But even if you're not sure what's going on, but you feel like there is some kind of bad situation going, feel free to still pick up the phone and call and get some, sometimes they'll just give you technical assistance on these numbers. So even if you just want to talk it through with someone. So let's start with one of the larger areas of neglect, of abuse, and that's neglect. Neglect is probably one of your tougher areas to identify. It is a caretaker that is not really taking care of someone's needs. Excuse me. So that could include someone that's failing to protect them from danger, exposing them to bad situations, like putting them in a car when they're drunk, exposing them to violent or inappropriate information or people, just basically not taking good care of them. What if you're not sure that the person who's neglecting them is a caretaker? I still say to report. If you don't know who this person is, that they're always around the child or they're always with this adult, but you don't know if they are really a caretaker, but you don't think whatever their role is that they're really fulfilling it, I would still go ahead and report it because you don't know, that could be their actual caretaker. So anytime someone is neglecting a child and they are in any way, shape, or form responsible for that child, I would say, when in doubt, go ahead and report it because then we can figure out what's going on. And a lot of times I talk to child service organizations and we don't really know who this person is. We can go, for instance, a whole school year or a whole summer or a whole grading period or a whole year, and this person who we thought was auntie is actually mom, or mom is actually auntie. So just know that the standard for caregiver is pretty broad. Neglect can look like begging, stealing, bad hygiene, bad looking clothes or ill fitting clothes, dirty clothes, not having the right medical care or glasses, wrong clothing for seasons, substance abuse, or just saying no one takes care of me or giving you verbal indications. And with children, they oftentimes will tell you that they're not being taken care of. It's amazing to me what children will actually tell you. Now, for you social workers that may be watching in, or you folks that work with social workers, if we think that a family is trying to get this together for a child but doesn't have the resources, oftentimes social workers will say, well, I don't think this is intentional neglect. I just think that they are in a tough financial situation. So I'm going to hook them up with resources. That's a judgment call. We'll talk about where the standard is. You can always still make the call to defects and say, look, here's the deal. I don't know if it's risen to the level of abuse yet, but here's what I'm seeing with a child. I'm going to hook them up with some social agencies, but I just want you to know. The other thing that's really interesting when you make a report is that those organizations have databases. So if you're calling about a child, and so has the church, and so has the school, and so has somebody else, they are going to have a way to meld that together. So you actually may be making a report that doesn't seem that exciting to you, or might seem kind of generic to you, but actually they have a file a mile thick on this family. And so it's important that you provide that information. But a lot of times we neglect, we will get our social workers involved to try to provide those wraparound services to the adult or the student or the child that needs services. Physical abuse, I think this is one of the most common ones that people seem to be able to recognize. We're talking about marks, unexplained bruises. They're terrified of their parent. They're terrified of their caregiver. They tend to cower when people come near them. They report that they've been injured or that they've been physically abused in some way. That one I won't spend a lot of time on. I think you kind of know what that means. Sexual abuse, that's a very broad category, and there's all kinds of descriptive language in the law about it, but sexual abuse is one of those things that's anything that's being done for sexual gratification of another person, which can include persuading, inducing, enticing, coercing this person to engage in sexual activity, exploiting them. We'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like, having them be in pictures or in movies or things like that. Sexual abuse can be very broad. You can tell there can be physical signs of sexual abuse. They can become much more modest and scared to change or use the restroom. And one thing that I hear from folks that work with children a lot is you become suspicious of sexual abuse when they have information that is inappropriate for their age. If they know things about sex acts and other things, or they try to reenact things like that, you know that something has been exposed. They've been exposed to something they shouldn't have seen. Also, with students or children or disabled people that would not necessarily know to be predators, but all of a sudden they are exhibiting predatory activities, that sometimes is an indication that they themselves have been victims of that same behavior. So those, not only are we going to maybe report the actions they took on somebody else, we're also going to report that student as possibly, or that child as possibly being abused, or that disabled adult. So it becomes quite tricky with sexual abuse, because you want to look at the whole picture and make sure you're reporting as many angles of it as you need to. Of course, becoming pregnant or getting an STD at a young age can be, or in a disabled status, can be a sign of sexual abuse. And then there's another category, sexual exploitation, and that can include human trafficking, buying, selling, trading, using them, pimping them out, using them as a prostitute, any kind of sexual or financial gain. It doesn't have to be financial gain. It can be other gain. And things that we notice with those is they have to suddenly have access to money that they wouldn't normally have. They dress inappropriately. They're runaways. They've got an older boyfriend or a friend that seems to be in control of them but is not a caretaker. Those are signs that maybe this person is being sexually exploited. Emotional abuse, toughest, I think maybe one of the toughest ones to identify. It's usually a pattern of behavior that basically breaks down the person. You'll see attempts and suicide is one of the most clear-cut signs that something's not right. Lack of attachment, inappropriate adult or infantile behavior, extremes in behavior. This one can be tough to identify, but those are some examples of what it can look like. Let's talk really quickly about Romeo and Juliet. I actually meant to insert this after the sexual offense one, but we'll talk about it now. We get sometimes students who are young, or children that are young, that interact with each other. And the question is that something I have to report to DFACS? I mean, they're two kids having some kind of relationship. Is that something I have to report? And the law actually recently changed in this area. So just to walk you through it, and it can be a little confusing. The first note, you do have to report consensual sex acts when the acts are between minors, if anybody involved in it was less than 14. Okay. So if there is a 13 or younger year old child involved, you have to report it. Even if they say, oh no, this is my boyfriend, and I'm 13 and he's 17, and I'm 13 and he's 15, you still have to report that. Okay, so anytime you go below, anytime you go below the age of 14, you're going to be in a reporting situation. However, let's say that they're over 14, but the other person involved is an adult. This is where it sort of makes your head hurt a little bit. So let's say you have a freshman in high school. That's the most common situation. A freshman in high school that is 14, and their boyfriend or their girlfriend is 18. Well, according to the law, that is not something that we have to report. They are not more than 4 years older. However, if we have a 14-year-old and a 19-year-old, now we've got a problem, and that's a reportable offense. Now, you ask yourself, how in the world am I going to know how old these kids are? You just have to go with your instincts. If you feel like there's a situation, again, if you have to ask me, I'm going to tell you, go ahead and report it. Try to find that information, but go ahead and report it. Okay. So what is abuse as far as endangerment? Watching domestic violence, being involved in some sort of crime, leaving your child in the car while you rub a drugstore or something like that, exposing them to extreme drug use, any kind of meth manufacturing. I know that sounds strange, but that's a specific area in the law that it says is considered abusive. Driving under the influence with a child in the car. So if someone picks up a child from your facility and they appear to be under the influence, then that would be something that we would report. And also, interestingly, exposing an unborn child to chronic or severe use of alcohol or controlled substances. So if you work with pregnant individuals and you are aware of this, then that's something that you're required to report. Also, financial exploitation. So this is going to be adults, obviously. The rest of these could apply to anyone, but this one's going to be for our adult population. improperly or illegally using their resources for the benefit of another person. So basically, cooking the bill, stealing their checkbook, getting a power of attorney from someone who really doesn't have the capacity, and then bilking them essentially or defrauding them of their money. And this could be elderly or disabled adults. So that's something that you are required to report. So what is the reporting trigger? What's the standard? How much certainty do I need to have? The law gives you a standard for both adults and students of reasonable cause to believe. So that is a very low standard. I would say it is like, if this is the table's the floor here, it is like an inch above it, okay? It's not a very high standard. So really, you don't have to know for sure. You don't need to know all of the facts. And it is not your job to become Perry Mason, okay, or Sherlock Holmes, to figure it out. Let me go interview all these folks, and let me see what she says, and let me talk to him, and let me compile a formal report. No, that's not your job. In fact, by doing that, you can actually ruin the forensic information that they need, especially, for instance, with sexual issues. If you have a sexual abuse situation and you take it upon yourself to start interviewing the people involved, you can actually destroy evidence. So don't put yourself in that situation. You don't have to. So why would you? Just when you reach the reasonable cause to believe, you make that report. Now, the organization you make the report to is going to need some basic information. Are they going to let you stay anonymous? Typically, they're not. So just know that you're going to probably have to give up your name. You're going to need to know some basic information. And if they don't have enough information, they may send you back to get more. And that's okay. But I would not spend your time, spin your wheels before you make a report trying to gather up 57 pages of documentation, okay, because that's not your job. So when in doubt, you report it, but the standard is it's very low. What's the process of reporting? Well, it varies depending on whether you're talking about adults or whether you're talking about children. As a general rule, there's a couple of different paths that you can set up in your organization for reporting. You can have a situation where the employee or volunteer notifies the person in charge or a designee, right? Let's say you have a social worker and you say that person would be the best person to receive this. Whoever your designee is going to be, you set that person up to receive those reports. And then that person is kind of the coordinator of the report, gets everything together, gets that report in a timely manner as required by law, and makes sure they follow up and keeps documentation. And the good part about that is you have a person who probably has a relationship with DFACS, with the social services folks, and they know how to do it, and they do it right, and they keep it going smoothly. That's a great thing. But the downside of that, we'll talk more about that, is that what if they're not there? What if they're on vacation? What if they throw a roadblock up? What if, so I would say if you're going to go that route, which is perfectly fine, make sure there are alternates. If you can't get a hold of her, call this person. If you can't get a hold of them, report it to this person. And then that person has to be well trained. Not only do your rank and file reporters have to be trained, that person needs specialized training on exactly how they're going to do that reporting and how they're going to maintain documentation. So it's not a bad way to do it. You just have to know that there are little glitches that you have to avoid. The other way is just to tell your people, you got a direct report. You are in charge of making sure that report gets done and then documenting. And I would say let someone designated at your facility know that it's been done, because otherwise we will not know what's going on. So the expectation for your folks should be that not only they report if you do the direct reporting, but that they let a certain person in your building know that the report has been made. And also that there's someone that can help them if they have questions or need assistance making the report. A lot of my folks that I work with actually use the designee method, but then they also say, look, if you can't get a hold of that person, then you just need to report, right? So maybe a combination would be best for you. So you just have to think about the needs and the structure of your building. For children, the employee or volunteer who makes a report to the person who's been designated has actually fully complied with the law. So just know if you do set that up, or Even when if you don't, I would say if you've got a person in charge of a facility that receives a report, even if your process is to make a direct report, that person should not say, oh, well, they're supposed to make a direct report, so I'm just going to sit on this and I'm going to go home this weekend and I'm going to grill out with my family and friends and I'm not going to worry about it. That person needs to, I would say, follow up as well and make sure not only are they telling me about it, but they've made the report. And if they haven't, I'll go ahead and make it. Because once they, for lack of a better term, dump it on you, they are at that point could be scot-free, but you've got the responsibility. So you need to make sure that not only do you lay it out, but don't get so hemmed into your own policy that you forget that you just need to do the right thing and get this thing over to DFACS or whoever, and make sure. And there's really no time frame. We'll talk about that. You can make a report in the middle of the night. So there's no business hours that you have to worry about. Years and years ago, DFACS would actually go on furlough. We would actually call DFACS and they weren't open. So that doesn't happen anymore. Now we've gone to regional reporting, and other agencies have as well. I believe the adult reporting is the same way. So there's no excuse. Anytime you call, they'll be there ready to take your report. The process of reporting, okay, we talked about the methods. You need to remember if you are the person, if you set up a designee process or you are the person that receives the report, and you're the one that needs to make the call, but you listen to it and you know this volunteer or you know this employee, and this employee is Chicken Little, right? The sky's falling, I saw something, and you think, I've been doing this for 20 years. That is not a handprint. That is just a bruise. Or she falls down all the time. This kid is the clumsiest kid I've ever seen. She rams into walls and bounces off the side of doors all the time. I know that's what this is. I know this family. They go to my church. There's no way that they did this. You need to stop yourself because you cannot stop a report from being made. If that reporter has received a reasonable cause to believe in their mind, then you need to go ahead and effectuate that report to be made. And you'll see this. You should not exercise any control, restraint, or modification or make the change to the information from the reporter. However, so that sensitive soul that's come to you and they're convinced that there's a report needs to be made, you got to go ahead and make it. However, you can add information to that report. So let's say you're making a report to DFACS and you think, I'm making this report, but I don't feel great about it because I just don't think that there's anything to this. Well, you can tell DFACS that. You can say, look, I'm the director of the facility. Here's what I know about the family. I personally do not think that this is accurate, but I am sharing it because I have a duty report. Now, do you want to spend a lot of effort and time talking them out of it? I would say no, that's not a good idea. But you can certainly add clarifying or contextual information to the report so that DFACS has a full picture or so that the reporting agency has a full picture. So just know you can't block it. You can't, I'm not going to say that because that's not right. You can't do that, but you can certainly add to it and make sure that they have a full picture. The process of reporting depends on the agency that you're reporting to. Generally, you are looking at an oral report with potentially a follow-up with a written report. Now, some of you may already be very skilled with the DFACS and the other agencies that take reports. And you may say, well, they don't let us call really. We have to send in like a really detailed form. That's okay because you've actually gone through some work with them and they've let you know what they need from you, and that's fine. But for those of you who don't have that standing relationship, generally it's just going to be a phone call to start, and then you're going to go from there. And they may ask you to follow up, they may ask you to do those things, and you need to comply with that and be cooperative. They may also ask you to follow certain submission requirements. I recommend that you do that to the best of your ability. And for those of you dealing with children, this is a sensitive topic, but there's been a lot of talk about photos in the past in the law. The law makes it clear that photos of injury can be taken without a parent's permission, but you would be required to submit those to DFACS immediately. It's really up to you. I am not a big fan of folks taking children in bathrooms and taking pictures of their intimate body parts. Feel like you are putting yourself in a difficult situation. Maybe even putting yourself in a situation where someone could be looking at you and saying, what are you doing to the child? So just use good judgment. If you are taking pictures of a child, I would recommend to avoid intimate body parts. That's buttocks, genital area, breast of a female. I would say that may be an area where you just want to stay away from that. And also, you always want to have another person with you. Preferably, at least one of you is the same sex as the child, so that you can just kind of keep that clean as far as if anybody asks about it later, that's just a good practice. Okay, so reporting contact information for children. I'm able to read at this moment. Here are the numbers. They are open 24/7. That is regional. That's statewide. So no matter where you are in the state, that's going to be the number that you call. Reporting contact information, and I had contract there. I'm so sorry. Just ignore that. Reporting contact information for adults. Law enforcement is something you do have to call with adults and disabled students. So not only do you need to call these folks, but you also need to call your jurisdictional police. So jurisdictional police, and you also need to call the Division of Aging Services Adult Protective Services. A lot of people call that APS. You need to call that. And if you're talking about a nursing facility or assisted living or something is going on in that vein, you also need to call this number. You see, it's a little more disjointed when we're dealing with adults, but I just tried to circle this up for you so that you had this available. Let's talk about time frame. When does that report actually have to be made? Well, I would say immediately, right now. The second that you can pull it together and get it done, you need to get it done. I would not luxuriously take your 24 hours that the law really kind of gives you. It's immediately, but not more than 24 hours. And we just can't get that in their hands fast enough. So I would recommend do what you've got to do. Make sure you've got all the ducks in a row so you can call and get that call made as soon as possible. You certainly do not want to go home for the day and not have made your report. I would say, oh, this is not something you say, oh, I'll get to it tomorrow. It's not like the light bill. It's not like that email from that annoying coworker or that annoying person that always emails you on Friday at 5 o'clock wanting to answer immediately. You've seen that commercial. It says, I need you to respond to this email before you wake up. That person. It's not like that. You need to get this out of your hands as quickly as possible. Don't let it wait overnight, because that person at that point could be in danger, and you don't want to live with that. So you want to make sure that you get that in the right hands so they can help that person as quickly as possible. What about protection? So you think, okay, I've got to do this immediately. I've got to make this phone call. I've got to give my name. I just feel very exposed here. What protections are here for me? And that's not selfish. That's a natural human thought. There are lots of protections for you if you are doing it in good faith. If you are doing it as to the best of your good faith abilities. So let's say you make this kind of a goofy report. It turns out to be kind of silly. Let me give you an example. When a child reports to a person, hey, I live in a tent. Oh my goodness, they live in a tent. Or my mom makes me live in a tent. Oh my goodness, they live in a tent. Report it. Find out later she has like a bed tent in her bedroom. Okay, so later you say, oh gosh, I can't believe I did that. Surely now my goose is cooked. No, it's okay. You made it in good faith. It's kind of silly, but you made it in good faith. Maybe asking a follow-up question in that situation would have been good. What do you mean by tent? What kind of tent is it? Where is the tent? That might have been, although I tell you not to be Sherlock Holmes, it might have been a good idea to get a little more information in that situation. But at that point, you've made a good faith report and you're off the hook. It's okay. You're immune from civil liability and you're immune from criminal liability. And that means you can't be taken out to jail and you can't be sued. No one's going to take your house away or take your car away. Okay. So that's something that is protecting you. I can't promise you that the person that you reported is going to not know who you are. I can tell you that APS and DFACS work very hard and are required by law to be confidential. However, there are times things slip out. What I recommend you saying if someone confronts you about a report is to say, I can't even confirm or deny that a report was made, because under the law, information about reports is confidential. So just keep yourself out of that conversation and just say to someone, I can't even confirm or deny that a report was made. Certainly, we'll talk a little bit more about this. Never call the caretaker and say, I made a report to DFACS, I made a report to APS about you or about your uncle or about this person, because that person now, that vulnerable person, is probably in much more danger now because you have done that. You're probably going to enrage that person, or it may put them in a situation where they make a run for it. So just know that is not something you share. You make the report and then you keep it to yourself. Occasionally, people you have reported are very savvy. They are not necessarily taking their first trip to the rodeo. So they may know that they can't tell me, but I'm pretty sure that this person's a mandatory reporter. So I'm going to go into Miss Jones's office, your office, and say, Miss Jones, I know you reported me to DFACS, and wait for Miss Jones to react so that I get my confirmation. They don't really know, but they're playing some mind games. So just know that that happens, and you need to make sure that you don't reveal anything in those situations. So you are protected in those situations, and you should, for the most part, stay anonymous, but I can't promise you that it's 100%. Now let's talk about what happens if you don't report. Remember how I said you won't be carted off to jail and you won't get sued, nobody will take your house away? That can happen if you don't report. District attorneys do, in fact, prosecute these cases. All you have to Google is child abuse and arrest for non-reporting, and you'll find situations across the country and in Georgia where folks have been arrested, educators have been arrested for not making reports. Not only not making reports, but not making them in a timely fashion. So make sure that you are keeping that in the back of your head. So remember, there's very little that can happen to you if you do report, but there's lots that can happen to you if you don't. So again, that's why I say, when in doubt, make the report. What if you feel like, gosh, I'm a counselor, I'm in a confidential relationship, I'm a doctor, I don't know if I'm allowed to call and share this information? This process trumps any confidentiality. There's exceptions in HIPAA, there's exceptions in FERPA, which is the educational federal law for folks that receive federal funding for educational agencies. There's exceptions in Georgia law for anyone who has these type of relationships with children or aging or disabled adults to be able to make these reports and share the information you need to share for them to investigate these reports. Okay, so there's a lot of confidentiality waivers that exist in the law, so that's not going to prevent you from reporting. There is an exception in the law for members of clergy, who receive it as part of a confession from a parishioner or someone who's in their church or some person who sought counsel from them, but only if religious doctrine requires that it be kept secret. I will tell you that almost every religion or religious organization, because of all the publicity, has gotten to the point where they are not keeping those confidences any longer and they are reporting. But if you work in that environment and you aren't sure, I would not wait until you get into a situation. I would seek some specific legal counsel about where is the line for this for my organization based on the facts of my organization. But I would say for the rest of you, you're basically, there's not going to be any prevention. If you're not sure, if you're in one of those helping professions and you have a licensure issue and you just want extra protection, I would definitely seek out, again, legal counsel specifically to what you do and make sure there's no pitfalls for you with your specific licensing requirements. But as a general rule, there is no confidentiality in those situations. And it's the same when DFACS or APS comes to interview the child or your staff. It is a good idea to cooperate with that. Now, if you've got an attorney that you work with or an executive director or something, you may want to go ahead and think about, okay, how are we going to handle that? Also, I always recommend that you get ID from the person who's coming, because we have had people impersonate those investigators. And if you're not sure if it's them, then get the number for DFACS or the office they say they work for. Not the number from them, but get the number from the, an objective source like their website or something, and call and verify that this person is in fact who they say they are. So that's just something that we do. We also do the same thing sometimes with law enforcement. It's not being rude, you're just making sure that they are who they say they are. So when do we get the police involved? Well, for adults, disabled population, and the elderly, you're going to do it every time you report. Okay, so every single time. For children, it's a little more complicated. I will tell you, you're welcome to call law enforcement every time you call DFACS if you want to. It's not necessarily a problem, but make sure if you do that, you are letting law enforcement and or DFACS know, hey, I've also called Johns Creek Police. Hey, I've also called Smyrna Police. Hey, I've also called APD, so that they are not duplicating efforts. Okay, so just make sure you keep them posted on who else you've called. And certainly if you called 911 or you've had to call an ambulance or something, let them know about that as well. But, you know, what I've heard from law enforcement folks with respect to children, and this is just my information they've provided me, obviously, if you feel like there's immediate action that needs to be taken, and you don't feel like it's happening quick enough, then you need to call 911 or your police. I always say just call 911. That's the easiest thing to do. Um, if there's an immediate danger situation or you feel like something's going to happen bad and I don't feel like anyone is taking this seriously and I know this situation is about to get violent or out of control or something like that, go ahead and get law enforcement involved. Also, definitely in sexual abuse matters, I would just go ahead and call the law enforcement. I've been told that when there's a sexual offender, particularly in the home, that if they have a crimes against children division in your law enforcement agency, for instance, if you live in Cobb County, I know Cobb County has a crimes against children agency. They will jump on that very quickly. But again, make sure you're letting them know. I've also called DFACS. I've also called the sheriff's department. I've also called whoever, so that they know and they can coordinate. And obviously, if there's any kind of evidence of a crime in addition to this, like domestic violence or some sort of shooting or I mean, the possibilities are endless. Prostitution, anything like that. Make sure you're also calling law enforcement and reporting that crime in addition to the abuse that could have been happening. And when you call 911, when there's a 911 situation, it's hard for me to describe that when you've got an emergency. And remember, DFACS is not going to be able to handle a 911 type emergency. So you may have to call 911 first, then call DFACS right after you called 911. Remember that just because you are reporting a child abuse or an elder abuse situation doesn't mean you should ignore any injuries that they have. So if a child is really injured or an adult is really injured, deal with the injury quickly. Deal with that, but you also may have to go down the other route of reporting to DFACS or reporting to APS. So just remember that there can be multiple levels of report. I may have to call the police. I may have to call over here to Aging Protective Services. I may have to also call 911 because there's a broken arm or something like that. So you may have to make multiple calls. Just remember that one agency may not be able to handle all the facets of a particular instance. Let's talk about a few common pitfalls that you may face, and then I'm going to start opening it up for any questions that you all have. So if I haven't hit what you're looking at, I'm happy to give it a try, take a swing at it. If you have no policy, no procedure, no training, no process for documentation, you are already kind of struggling here. I would recommend you get that in place. Get some processes in place, even if they are pretty vague but we will make mandatory reports as required by law until you can get somebody in there who can help you get a more specific process set up or until you can get a good process set up. And I'll tell you that school districts publish their child abuse protocols. The counties publish their child abuse protocols. If you contacted, let's say, Fulton County and said, can you give me all the child abuse protocols for the county, they would provide those to you. It's an open record. And you could look at what they do, and maybe one of those could be helpful for you. But also, I mean, I'm a lawyer, so I would say you probably want to get some legal advice, but that might be a good place to start. Also, you want to make sure anybody who reports documents who they spoke to, what time they called, what number they called, because if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. That's just one of those rules that we follow as lawyers. So make sure that your folks are documenting. Make sure that you've got onboarding and refresher training for your volunteers and your staff. There's some great training resources online that are very cheap, and I'll show you those in a second. Make sure you're not waiting until Monday or the next morning. We already talked about that. Make sure that if you do have a designee for reports, that person is readily available and there are backups for that person and everybody knows who they are. Make sure you don't censor a report. Don't play Sherlock Holmes. Remember, you can ask a few clarifying questions, but it's not your job to decide whether or not you think it's accurate. Once you hit that reasonable cause to believe, you are now in a reporting space. So you need to go ahead and get that done. Make sure you do not inform the caretaker of the report, and make sure that we're reporting in every situation that needs to be done. I think that goes without saying. I've given you some resources here. The Governor's Office for Children and Family has actually through an outside organization that I believe they've contracted with, provides inexpensive mandatory training. It's a great resource. It's like $10 I mean, it's very cheap. And it seems to have, based on my review of it, all kinds of different topics for medical people. And so you might find some good training you can use right there for a very low price. And also the DFACS website. Sometimes we forget about that. You can go there, and they've got some great resources there as well. And there's also a link here for a list of some of the common reporters, and a tab that even has a really detailed mandatory reporting manual. So if you're doing a deeper dive into this and you're interested, you could read that. So those links are provided for you, and I think they're really helpful. For adults, and most of those are for children, I started parsing out this website for you and breaking it down, but actually there's so much good stuff here. I would just go to this website. It's great. They've got all of the contact and reporting. There's additional reporting folks that you can reach out to for fraud, the governor's office. I mean, there's just resources galore here if you deal with adults and potential reporting situations. So I would definitely recommend you just spend some time looking at that. And as you know, the time to do that is now. The time is not when you're in an emergency. So I would say if you get some time, start working on this. If you don't have a process in place, then you can take advantage of these good resources before you're in a panic mode. For more information about the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta, you can certainly visit their website, which also has great information, email or call. So I appreciate your attention. I hope this was helpful for you. I'm going to now look over to the folks in the room with me here and see if there's any questions that I can answer, and we'll just go from there.
There is one question that I have, and hopefully others will take their questions in as I'm talking. When you're setting up your process to create a mandatory reporter within your organization, would it be appropriate in some circumstances to use board members as the reporters, especially if you don't have a lot of employees?
That's a great question. So the question was, if you have a board, should you use board members as the designee, the person that reports? I don't think that's a problem. I would definitely talk to your board members. Depends on what your board members do and what their day jobs are. I would talk to them and see, does that work? If it does work for them and it works for your organization, that's possible. And so you could, if you have, let's say, 10 members on your board, you can say any of them, and if you can't reach any of them immediately, then here's the process we want you to follow. So you could do that. It doesn't really specify who it has to be. So it's really up to you in your organization what works. I'll tell you, in educational organizations, oftentimes it's the school social worker or the guidance counselor. It could be if you have somebody, a helper person like that, it could be in that situation. Or if you don't have a lot of employees, it could be the board members. That's a great question. I think it's very flexible. So the good news is, I know sometimes with the law, you really just want to give me the answer, but it's actually quite flexible, and that's a good thing in this situation because you can set it up. Any other questions? Okay, well, that probably means that I answered